All right. Um, yeah. All right. So I guess we can get started then as we go, more people will join in. But yeah, thank you for coming here today to do this talk. We really appreciate it. And yeah, and thank you for the audience for tuning in as well today. So just to get started, I guess we can just start off with like an introduction about you if you'd like to tell everyone who you are. That'd be amazing.
Sure. So my name's Rich Harris. I am a software engineer at Vercel these days. I joined the company back in November. Prior to that, I spent my entire career in the news business as a journalist, writing JavaScript for news articles, things like interactive data visualizations and things like that. So I worked at The Guardian and I worked at the New York Times before joining Vercel. And in my free time, as kind of side projects for a long time, I worked on tools that would allow me to do my job at the New York Times and the Guardian. Um, and the one that people probably best know me for is Svelte, which is a front end framework. Um, I've worked on other open source projects in my time. I helped build a thing called Rollup, which is a JavaScript module bundler. And now that's working on JavaScript full time is my job now that I work at Vercel.
Yeah, that's awesome. You've done like quite a lot just in the open source community and the developer community that has improved so many people's like day-to-day workflows. And yeah, that's really awesome. So I guess we can kind of get started with some bigger questions here. Obviously you've created or like started Svelte. And I know a question that myself and a lot of people have had is what originally gave you the idea of Svelte, in taking into consideration other frameworks such as React, Vue, etc.
Yeah, so it's not actually my first rodeo. I've been thinking about front end frameworks for a very long time. Because when I started in interactive journalism, there just weren't a lot of really good tools for doing stuff. For those of you who have done much web development, you're probably familiar with the way that you would use document.query selector to grab elements and do element.innerHTML to update the contents and element.add event listener to add interactivity. And all of these things are very verbose, very difficult to write large code bases with because things get out of hand very quickly when you're writing things in that kind of step-by-step fashion. And so when I was starting doing this, which is, back in, I guess, 2011, 2012, the tools that were available at the time just weren't particularly good. And so even though I was a little bit new as a programmer, I didn't really know what I was doing. I started writing things that would just kind of make my life easier. So as I was learning things, I was going back and like turning those lessons into tools that future me could use to make my life easier. And so I started a project called Ractive, which is kind of short for interactive. It's a word that comes from the Neil Stevenson book, the sci-fi author. The book in question is called The Diamond Age, and it's part of it is about like the future of interactive storytelling, and so it felt very applicable to what I was doing. And so I was building this library called Ractive for a few years, and it kind of coincided chronologically with the launch of React and the launch of Vue, and so like as a first project, it was the thing that taught me about how to build open source, and it was the thing that taught me about how not to write a front end framework. And so a few years down the line, it was very apparent to me that this thing that I had built, while usable, like we'd used it a lot at the Guardian, and it was fun, and people enjoyed working with it. It didn't really have much of a future, and it was totally inferior to other frameworks, especially React and especially Vue. Around that time, I had been playing around with compilers and bundlers because I've been working on Rollup, and so the idea of being able to take some code from one form that you'd written, you could write native JavaScript modules, and then you could turn it through this process of compilation into something else that could run in what were at the time modern browsers, meant that I was kind of thinking about what it would mean to transform code in a more aggressive fashion from something that was designed to be used for describing user interfaces into something that would just run natively in the browser. And I wasn't alone in having these thoughts. I was having conversations with other people around the time. There's a really healthy programming community in New York, and we would meet often, and people were talking about these sorts of ideas. And so one day I was just particularly frustrated with Reactive, and I thought, you know what, I'm just going to do it again, but this time I'm going to do it as a compiler. And so that is how Svelte started. It was me kind of atoning for my sins of having built a not very good front end framework, and I wanted to build a better one. And that's how it started. And it began life as this experiment in producing something that was very small and very fast. And over time, it's evolved into something a little bit more rounded. It's designed to be like a really nice way to build user interfaces. That's how it started.
Yeah, it seems like you've like had a lot of thought into just like overall before you started Svelte. And it seems like you've like played around with a bunch of different things and experimented a ton, which is amazing. So when did Svelte start? And was it always open source, or did you decide to make it open source like recently?
No, it was open source right from the get-go. So the first version, I was kind of working a little bit in secret and I didn't talk about it, but it was always on GitHub. And it went straight to version 1.0, because what possibly needs to change before it becomes a stable version. And that was in November 2016. So 5 years and change, 5 years and 3 months ago.
Oh
Um,
yeah.
and in the beginning, like no one really knew what it was. It didn't really have any users. There were a few people who are very interested in these kinds of technologies that um, started paying attention, and a few people who had previously used Reactive started paying attention. And so that was the early community that started using Svelte. And for a long time, it was a very small, tight-knit group of us who were working on this project, and the wider world really had no idea. And it was in 2019 when we launched our third version of the framework, Svelte 3, that people started paying attention, because we'd redesigned it around what we perceived to be the needs of the community.
Yeah, that's awesome. So I mean, since you mentioned that Svelte when it first released wasn't that popular as like most projects, obviously. What made it become like very popular? Was there any like did you do any like marketing for it? Did you like launch it anywhere? How did people get to know about it more?
We got really lucky with our launch. A few things coincided. So number one, we've been working on V3 for a long time, months. The core team had been huddling in Discord and like sharing wacky ideas about how we could reinvent the framework. And it all came to fruition in the spring of 2019. Around that time, I was invited to give a talk in Israel at You Gotta Love Front End conference. And I talked about how the design of Svelte was supposed to try and make JavaScript into a reactive language. And that really resonated with some people. And we had a blog post, and was the video from the conference, and there were a couple of podcasts, and all kind of coincided on a particular day in April or May 2019. And so it meant that for people who people who discover projects by looking at GitHub, they could see it happening on GitHub. People who like to use documentation and tutorials, we had that ready for them. People who like discovering things through podcasts, we had a podcast. People who like to watch videos, we had a video, and we had a launch blog post as well. So however people discover these things and learn about new projects, we managed to have like a hook for those people. And so the combined effect of all of those things was that we had like this huge surge of interest all of a sudden, and that's when it took off.
Yeah, it seems like you guys it kind of just like went on by its own, just like because of what it is. It doesn't seem like you guys did a ton of like much promoting. So yeah, that's really awesome. Seeing that now in 2016, I don't think you would have guessed where it is now as a language. So yeah, it seems like it's been like a very crazy growth. But yeah, that's really awesome. So you like I know since I'm pretty sure Svelte's not it wasn't your first like kind of like major project or just project in general, obviously because you might have had other projects that you worked on beforehand. And I know you're involved in a lot of open source stuff. And I've also seen that you have maintained Rollup. I'm not sure if that you're currently doing that, but were you one of the people that started Rollup, or did you join later on? And for the people in the audience that don't know what it is, it would be great if you could explain that.
Yeah, I started Rollup back in 2015 maybe. And what it is, so I'm not currently an active maintainer of Rollup. It's been taken over by other better programmers than me. But what it is a module bundler, and the context for this is that a few years ago we had this new module syntax in JavaScript, but it wasn't yet implemented in any browsers. So the import export syntax that everyone uses nowadays was back then just this kind of idea. It didn't have any implementations. But it was a really good idea because it allowed you to do certain things that prior to that point had been quite difficult. And one in particular is the idea of tree shaking. And what that means is that you can have a library that exports a bunch of different functions. And if something is using that library, it's probably only going to be using a subset of those functions. Module bundlers before Rollup would just grab the entire library and turn it into a big bundle of script that you would then run in the browser. And as we all know, when you're building stuff on the web, size is at a premium. You want to make the script that gets downloaded by the browser and executed as small as possible. And because Rollup was designed around this new JavaScript module syntax, it was able to get rid of the unused functions in a library. And so that's kind of how it began. It began similarly to Svelte as an experiment in making things smaller and faster. And it got an audience among library authors, people who were building their own libraries, became quite avid users of Rollup. And so even though it's not as mainstream as something like Webpack, it's quite widely used by the open source community. Completely forgotten what the question was.
Oh, it was uh it was well, it was just explaining what rollup is. And oh, actually, you just answered them both. So yeah, yeah. So yeah, I think you pretty much answered both of them. I can't think of what else I asked, but yeah, that's really awesome. And I know that a lot of people in BuilderGroop also use Rollup, and myself too. I've used it for a bunch of past projects, and it's amazing. And I'm really a huge fan of Rollup and the ESLint. They're both really good. But yeah. So I guess my next question from here is, we've talked about Rollup and Svelte, both huge successes. But I kind of want to talk about some of the projects that you built when you first started out, that maybe haven't gone as popular, or projects that you wanted to get popular but didn't go the way that you wanted them to go. So yeah, that would be awesome.
Well, one springs to mind. I don't know how many people here use Babel or Babel. Has different pronunciations depending on who you ask. This is a project that back in the day, before modern JavaScript ran on all browsers, you needed to convert your modern JavaScript into the previous version, ES5. And the best tool for doing that was Babel. And it was good, but it was also kind of slow and a little bit confusing to use. And I worked in a newsroom where speed was very much of the essence. And the output of Babel, because it was very, very strictly spec compliant, was quite a bit larger than the code that you wrote in the first place. And so I was a little bit cheeky and I wrote a library called Buble, which is sort of a take on Babel, which was designed to do a subset of what it did much faster, in a much simpler way. Instead of having plugins that you could extend it with, and instead of being absolutely spec compliant at the expense of ballooning the size of your code, it would convert your modern JavaScript into JavaScript that ran everywhere, like very, very, very straightforwardly. And it was something that I built so that I could use it at work primarily, but I open sourced it because it's always worth open sourcing these things. And it never really took off. And in fact, it's probably caused more harm than good in the JavaScript ecosystem, because some people started using it and they found that those spec compliant edge cases that I was talking about do in fact matter for some people. And so that is probably the project that springs to mind when you ask about things that didn't go so well. But I'm sure there's all sorts. I mean, my GitHub account is just full of abandoned repos. And now I kind of want to go through and see what I started and then forgot to finish. I'm sure there's a lot.
Yeah, it seems you have a ton of repos based off of your GitHub too.
Yeah, I mean, this is what open source is all about. Like you try things and you throw it at the wall and see what sticks. And sometimes in the course of scratching your own itch, you will discover that you're scratching other people's itches too. And if that's the case, then you'll be able to grow a community and people will start using your thing and contributing to it. And eventually you hope it becomes self-sustaining. But the vast majority of open source projects don't turn out that way. Most of the time it's just experiments that go nowhere. And that's totally fine. I mean, that's the nice thing about working in the open, is that you can do that and it doesn't really matter. Like no one's expecting perfection straight off the bat.
Yeah, and I do agree with that. Open source is all about just finding a bunch of different ideas that you can provide value in and like that you can build on top of. And then one of them will eventually people will find useful, other people. So yeah, I do agree with that, and that's really good. The way you put it. But yeah, that's really awesome. So. I kind of want to go back to just like not projects or anything like that, but just you yourself and programming. So I was actually curious how you got started into programming, and if there were anyone that you found as inspiration to you or that really helped you along the way.
So many people. I started programming when I was very young. My dad was quite into computers, and he's also very into photography. And there are photographs of me as a toddler playing around with. I don't even know what kind of computer it was, but this is like the ZX Spectrum era, back when before the internet, when if you wanted to try out a program that you like the look of, you literally had to type it in from a listing that was printed in a magazine. And I was obviously a nerdy child, although I didn't really keep up with programming into my teens. I kind of found other interests. And then it was while I was looking for work as a journalist at the start of my career, that I suddenly remembered that programming was a thing that I enjoyed. And at that time, everyone was saying, if you want to get a job in journalism, then you've got to be able to show that you're proficient in all of these digital techniques. You've got to be able to have your own self-hosted blog and all of these other things. And so I started like tinkering around with PHP and eventually JavaScript. But it didn't really take. I don't really know what I was doing. But then as I got into journalism, after I eventually found a job, I was really inspired by the work that was happening at places like the New York Times and the BBC and the Guardian and other places where they were using Flash and increasingly JavaScript to tell interactive stories. And they were able to tell stories that just couldn't be told any other way. And I looked at that and I was like, I want a piece of that. So that is how I began taking programming seriously and considering it to be part of my job. And it was only possible because I was working at a company that had a development team full of people who were very generous with their time. As I'm sure everyone here knows, programming is, I mean, it's kind of a solitary activity most of the time, but it's very hard to do if you don't have people that you can bounce ideas off, and people who can review your code, and people who can introduce you to new techniques and new libraries. And I was very lucky in that I had a bunch of people who were very generous in helping me learn what was what. And I started with jQuery. That was the first thing that that I got to know. And so to answer the question about who was I inspired by, John Resig, the creator of jQuery, was definitely one of those people. Jeremy Ashkenath was another one who I was following his career from early in my career as a programmer, because he had created so many things that were incredibly clever and useful, like Underscore and Backbone and CoffeeScript. Mike Bostock is another one that I was incredibly inspired by, because he had created D3, which is the visualization library that that people use to make the kind of interactive charts and graphs that you see, particularly on news websites, but also in science and academia, and in other places. So yeah, I've been lucky to have both had some great role models to emulate, but also people in my orbit who have helped me learn how to program. And I think that's probably the most important thing as a programmer, is to have that kind of support.
Yeah, that's awesome. It seems like also a lot of people have helped you, like you said, during the days of when you first started it, before your teen years, during, but not really, since you didn't do it as much, but yeah, even afterwards too, which is always good to have people support along the way. Because as you move along, it's always good to have someone there that can help you in case anything happens, if you need help, just overall support. So that's really awesome. So yeah, and I just wanted to ask also, like when did you start? Like, well, when was the first line of code that you write? Like that you wrote? Sorry, when was that?
It was I was probably young enough that I don't actually remember it. Although I do remember one episode at primary school. I must have been probably like 6 or 7, and we had these computers called the BBC. What are they called? Someone from this era is who knows the answer. But these integrated devices where the keyboard and the monitor, which is huge, they're all part of the same big plastic box. And I knew how to get into BASIC, which was the programming language that was on these devices. And I started writing a program. I wrote print 10, print hello, 20, go to 10, which, as most of you probably know, just like prints the word hello on repeat. And my classmates were looking at the screen and said, no, 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 you can't run that. It says print hello. And they thought that meant that it was going to send it to the printer. And we're all going to get in trouble because the printer was going to just start spewing this stuff. And the teacher was going to come in and was going to yell at us for misbehaving with the computer. And I remember just like smiling smugly and hitting enter, and seeing the gasps on their faces as they saw what it actually did. And so even at that age, knowing how to get inside the guts of a computer and start playing with programming languages felt like a little bit of a kind of a superpower, and that part has never left.
Yeah, that's awesome. That sounds like a really great story from when you first started learning to code. So yeah, that's really amazing. So yeah, I guess my next question after that would be, since this time that you started learning to code up until this point, 2022, you've obviously worked on a ton of projects. So have there been any that have been your absolute favorite?
Oh wow. I mean, I really love working on Svelte, and I'm so blessed that I get to work on that as a full-time thing. Just because like we've managed to build such a wonderful community around it, and it really feels like we're actually doing something that kind of matters, you know, because if you can enable people to build their own applications more quickly, then it's kind of like a force multiplier effect. That feels really satisfying when we see things that people have made using the thing that we made. The things that I think probably bring the biggest smile to my face are some of the projects uh, that I've worked on in my time in the news industry. 'Cause we used to build all sorts of like, very frivolous projects. Uh, like what springs to mind? A few years ago, President Obama did a State of the Union address, and we wrote a program that would live translate it into emojis for our audience. We've built games around the Oscars. We've built um, interactive pieces that are part of investigations into police violence. We've done um, coverage for presidential elections. All of those things are like really, really fun to work on, partly because you're doing so under a very compressed time period. You have to like build a thing very quickly, and then you just sort of throw it out into the world and pray that it doesn't break. And just the adrenaline rush of working on those kinds of projects is something that I think everyone should experience at some point in their career.
Yeah, I do agree with that. It's always good to have something that will like and like just like to add on to that, it's always good to have something that will keep you excited. So yeah, and also like since like you've also built a lot of projects too, I just wanted to add on to what I said earlier. A question that I have for you is how do you cope with burnout if you've ever had that, or balance with your time? Now with Vercel and Svelte, you have to manage both of those and any other projects that you're working on, or even before Vercel. How would you manage your time between different projects or things outside of programming and in programming, etc.?
I definitely have experienced burnout, and I think most people who work in open source eventually do experience burnout in some form. And it's not pretty. It's something that you should try and take pains to avoid if you can. Um, the only cure when that does happen is to just take some time off, go and do something else, whether that's, you know, being outdoors, cooking, reading books, playing music, just like anything other than programming, anything other than being on GitHub. You just kind of have to completely shut yourself off from it for a little while, and eventually you'll rediscover the motivation for working on it. But you can't force it. But obviously, it's better if that doesn't happen in the first place. And so, as I've become more experienced at working on open source stuff, I've become a little bit more vigilant about recognizing when I'm starting to feel burnt out. And I try and I try and make sure that I'm not working on open source so much that I'm going to become prone to burnout. And so that means, you know, building in routines that force you to be doing other things, like make sure that you're, you know, going outdoors once a day, and it sounds silly, but like making sure that you're seeing people in real life, and that you're eating well, and that you're shutting down your laptop at the weekends if you can. Like all of these things are super important because, as I say, once you do get burnout, and everyone does at some point, it's really unpleasant and it takes a while to recover from. Um, and you know, you never want to lose the joy of programming, because most of us do it because we really, really enjoy it. And it sucks if something that you consider to be one of your biggest hobbies becomes something that you kind of start to dread. And so, yeah, keep an eye out for it. Don't let it happen to you.
Yeah, that's really good advice that you have there, and I do agree that um, a lot of people, obviously you're experienced now, but a lot of people in this audience in the community, at BuilderGroop or just in general even, sometimes it might be hard to like know when you're about to have a burnout because you've just been like constantly working and working that it feels almost natural at this point. But in reality, it's not your average day-to-day workflow. But it takes a while for some people to realize that, and as it happens over and over again, you kind of get either used to it or you will start to realize that it's good to manage your time and figure out ways that work for you best and having something that you can that will be sustainable even in the future too. So yeah, that's awesome what you had to say
It's
there.
good to keep an eye on each other as well. Like
Yeah.
if you're working on a team with someone and it feels like they might be working too hard and overstretching themselves, then just like keep an eye on that and see if you can help make sure that your teammates and your friends aren't succumbing to burnout.
Yeah, I do agree with that too. But yeah, that's awesome. So yeah, I guess now we can talk about instead of the past, we can kind of talk about the future now. And as you know, and the audience too, you've obviously started recently working at Vercel. So I have a few questions about that. One of them being, what made you choose Vercel? And how did you end up at Vercel?
So I ended up there because I mean, I kind of cheated my way into a job. I happen to know the founder of Vercel, Guillermo Rauch. We've kind of interacted on and off for a few years because we're both part of the open source world, and he's interested in Vercel being more than a Next.js company. So for those of you who don't know Vercel and don't know Next.js, Vercel is a company that makes it easy for you to host your own websites, and Next is a framework that makes it easy for you to build them. And the two things have always sort of been kind of side by side. Next is built within Vercel, and Vercel is the best place to deploy your Next apps. And there's this perception that Vercel is kind of a Next-centric platform, which isn't necessarily true, but it's it's definitely the case that um, people see things that way. And there are plenty of people who, for whatever reason, don't want to use React. They don't want to use Next. They want to use other technologies. And Gashema wants Vercel to be a place where those other technologies are also first-class citizens. And so I was kind of in the right place at the right time because as he's having these thoughts and plans, I'm starting to think maybe it's time for me to move on from the New York Times and consider something else. I would really love to be able to work on Svelte more. I think it has like a really bright future at the moment. We have lots of ideas that we're very excited about. And so we just happened to have a conversation in which he suggested me joining Vercel to work on Svelte full time. And it was just a complete no-brainer. Obviously we had to have conversations about what that would mean for Svelte's governance, because it's very important that Svelte maintains its status as an independent project. But once we'd had all of that stuff kind of ironed out, it really felt like nothing but upside. So, we started talking, I think, in maybe late September, and by early November I'd started. So it was very quick, and it just felt like a really good fit.
Yeah, that's awesome. Vercel is an amazing company, and it's really exciting to see that they're expanding on from Next itself is also a really good web framework, and it's also good to see that they're expanding from just Next and supporting all these new different tools. And yeah, Svelte is really awesome too. So yeah, I think that was a really good decision both for Vercel and yourself. So that's really cool. But yeah. I guess another question that I have, unrelated to Vercel, but directed towards you would be, are there any new technologies that you've wanted to learn either last year or this year that you haven't gotten a chance to learn yet?
Yeah, I have a bit of an inferiority complex about the fact that I haven't learned Rust or Go or Zig or any of those languages. Um, it's pretty clear that there's a huge momentum around Rust in particular. A lot of tooling is getting rewritten in Rust, and for very good reasons. And particularly with WASM, like a lot of that stuff is applicable to web development too. And so I feel like someone in my position who, I've worked on these things that are very sort of performance centric. I should be spending some time learning how to use these languages, but I just haven't had the time. And so that is probably the thing that I'm most excited to be able to work on one day, is seeing whether it makes sense to start rebuilding little bits of our stack using faster and lower level languages than JavaScript and TypeScript. Uh, Zig in particular is it's a little bit more niche than Rust, but there's some extremely cool stuff that is coming out of the Zig community. Bun is one example of a project that I'm very envious of. It looks absolutely amazing. So I guess that's what I'm excited about. That's what I want to look at next.
Yeah, that's really awesome, and I know Rust itself has been growing a lot the past year. Mainly the past year actually. But even before that, it's been super fast in its growth, and I know a lot of people have been wanting to learn it. And it is a really good language. And it is super fast to go as well. But yeah, that's really awesome, and I know these languages would be worth it to learn, depending on what you're using them for. But I definitely do agree. Those are some very good two languages that are good to learn. But yeah, that's awesome. So I guess my next question from here would be, well, I know now you're working at Vercel, and beforehand, you've had other open source projects, not startups. I'm not sure if you've had a startup before, but how do you plan to, like, where do you see yourself in the next 5 to 10 years? Do you have a plan to build a startup on your own, or just continue working at Vercel, working at other companies, or just continuing your open source journey?
I mean, I'm definitely not going to do a startup because I just don't have any of the skills that are required to do that. I'm very bad at thinking about money. I'm very bad at thinking about like product market fit. Um, like all of those things, I, I just have no interest in, and I would be very bad at. So I prefer to leave other people to do that. For now, I'm not really thinking about the future beyond Vercel because I just got there and there's so much work to do that is going to keep me occupied for like at least the next 2 years, I think, before I can even think about what would come after Svelte. But I don't know. I really enjoy working in web development. I'm an old school web head. I think that the web is like very important for humanity, and I want to be part of the web community as long as it exists. And I really enjoy working on tools that allow other people to execute on their own creative visions. And so if it's not Svelte, then it's probably going to be something adjacent, something else that is similarly inclined towards creators and builders. But I haven't even begun to think about what that could be.
Yeah, yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, I know a lot of people, either that like they're not looking to start a startup just because of either skills or stuff like that. But it does make sense what you just said. So yeah, that's really cool. Um, and right now, kind of going back to just like languages, besides Svelte, are there any other languages that are your favorite, currently working on, or stuff like that? I mean, well, I know you might use like some languages for different things, obviously, but based off of like most languages that you've worked with, are there any that are your favorite? Is the question that I have.
I I wish I spoke more languages. I basically know JavaScript and TypeScript and HTML and CSS, and that's about it. But the nice thing about those is that's kind of all you need. If you know JavaScript and TypeScript, then you can write software that is accessible to everyone in the world. And this is why I'm so keen on the web, is that you can go so far with like with just that in your tool belt. I don't know, what languages should I learn?
Yeah, I think what you said earlier, like I know I know there are a ton of languages, obviously, but TypeScript itself is a really good language, and I know you've also said that you wanted to learn Rust and Go, which are also very very good ones. But yeah, I think there's so many that you could possibly learn. But I know there are some that if you've like just learned those, you could do so much with them. And you can learn obviously more languages than that, but it can either be just for fun or you're just like really curious, etc. But yeah, that's really cool. And it's really insane to see that there have been and currently are languages that do so many cool stuff. And yeah, it's really awesome to see that. And it shows that how much the web and just development and programming has evolved over the like past like how many years have gone by since it first started. But yeah, that's really cool. Um, so another question that I had is your online presence. So what do you think really led to either your like GitHub or Twitter presence? Do you think it was just mainly just your open source contributions, or what do you think brought you to this point in terms of on GitHub, Twitter, or other platforms?
Uh, so GitHub, I've never really thought of GitHub as a social platform, and I know that it is. I know that people do treat it as such, but I've never thought about my presence as GitHub, my presence on GitHub as being a kind of like a social presence or part of a personal brand or anything like that. Um, Twitter, on the other hand, uh, like Twitter is it's kind of a ridiculous thing, but everyone on Twitter is on this sort of weird stage and we're all performing to each other. And through no fault of my own, I've got a bunch of followers on Twitter. And so I'm at the point where I do need to think a little bit about like the things that I tweet. And the reason that that's happened has been entirely because of open source. Um, I I'm verified on Twitter because I used to be in the news industry, and a lot of people in the news industry automatically get verified. Um, but the main reason that people follow me on Twitter is because of the JavaScript stuff, and you can actually see like I've seen charts of follower count, and it was after Svelte 3 launched that people started following me on Twitter, and you can see there's like elbow in the curve. So it's very clear to me that no one cared what I had to say before my open source work became popular. Um, so I guess if you want an audience on Twitter, then open source is one way to achieve it. But I don't know that having an audience on Twitter is anything that anyone should really aspire to have.
Yeah, it makes sense. And of course, as you said, like Svelte was one of the biggest launch that also brought Svelte to become really popular and like where it is today. So it does make sense that people would obviously follow the creator too. But yeah, that's just awesome. And it seems like you've gotten really popular from that too. So very good to see. So yeah, I guess that is all the questions from me. And I guess we can start going through the Q&A questions from the audience. And if anyone else has in the audience that is currently listening has any questions, there's a thread that you can put your questions in. So I guess we'll start off for the first one, which is from Vert, and they ask, "What was your parents' view on all of this?" Oh, there we go.
Sorry.
Oh, no worries, no worries.
I'm an old person. I'm not good with technology. What do my parents think? They don't really understand what I do for a living. To be honest, they have like a vague idea. But I think they're just happy that I seem to be doing something that I enjoy, and they're happy that like programming is an industry where you can make a good living. I remember when I started out as a journalist, and my sister's a journalist too, and they kind of sighed a little bit, like, oh no, both of our children are journalists, because as enjoyable as that career is, it's not the most lucrative. And so yeah, I found myself in a niche where I'm doing something that I enjoy, and as programmers, we're pretty well paid to do it. And so they're happy, even if they have no idea what it is that I do.
Yeah, that's that's awesome. And yeah, I know a lot of people's parents too, just like in this community too, like they have no idea what people are doing, but they just like have a sense of idea, just like your parents do. So yeah, that's really awesome. So for the next question, um, the player of Doom asks, how does it feel to be working for a company developing Next.js since React is a competitor to for Svelte?
Well, so Next has always been a big inspiration for me and for the rest of the team. Like for those of you who haven't used these things, Next is a framework built on top of React that kind of pioneered the idea of having a file system based router, which makes it really easy to build large applications with like a really sensible project structure. So it's really good for working on big teams, and it's really easy for like to make things very quickly. And SvelteKit, which is the like as React is to Next, Svelte is to SvelteKit. SvelteKit is very heavily inspired by Next, and so with I've always thought of it less as competition and more as inspiration. Um, because the people who are currently using Next, they're not going to use SvelteKit instead because they're using React, and Svelte is a very different thing. So we kind of see the projects as being friends rather than enemies, and we've always had a pretty good relationship with the team. We've like shared ideas with them about like how to do routing and things like that. And so me being at Vercel just kind of means that I have like a direct line of communication with that team more often, and I can see the conversations that they're having in their Slack channel. So it's all good. It's like we have a really healthy relationship. Like we share ideas with each other. We're all like friends. We all get along. And so it's definitely not like a conflict of interest or anything like that. I understand that people might look at it and think that it's a little bit weird that Vercel is effectively sponsoring the development of two frameworks that seem like competitors, but it's a really healthy dynamic and it makes sense.
Yeah, that makes sense. And yeah, I like as I said earlier too. It's awesome to see Vercel like taking the initiative to support both of these languages since they both have their own place in the developer ecosystem. So it's really awesome. So yeah, for the next question from Wishori, they ask, were there any days where you were like, this would suck, or just like lacked motivation and nearly gave up on something? And if so, how did you overcome this?
Oh, all the time. I mean, this comes back to the burnout question in part because you never lose motivation more than when you're feeling burnt out. But I think every open source maintainer at some point feels slightly ashamed of the things that they've built. Because, as in every aspect of life, in the same way that when people post things on Instagram or Facebook, they're sort of showing a curated version of their lives, and you sort of look at it and think, well, my life isn't that glamorous. The same is true, I think, in open source development. Like you look at the things that other library authors are producing, and you look at the documentation, and you think, oh, this is a really smart idea. This thing is like implementation is really beautiful. And what you don't realize is that inside the code base, it's just a rat's nest. And that is I think true for an awful lot of software. And you as the maintainer, you're conscious of your own rat's nest, but you're not necessarily conscious of everyone else's. And so it's very hard sometimes to take a step back and appreciate the work that you've produced from the perspective of the people who are using it, as opposed to the people who are maintaining it. And I think that's the way that you overcome it as well. Is you actually spend time with your community, and you try and look at things through their eyes, and you think about all of the problems that you've solved, all of the things that you've enabled people to do, and don't focus on all of the open issues on the GitHub tracker and all of the to-do comments inside the code base of the things that you've been meaning to tidy up later but haven't got around to yet. Because everyone has that. It's the same for everyone, and you should never feel ashamed about the state that your code base is in.
Yeah, I do agree with that too. Because I know, like, for a lot of people at a certain point, code bases will always get messy. Even if they are just starting out with their project, or even later on as it progresses, and gets larger, it'll always be harder to keep that very clean code base. So yeah, I do agree with that too. So all right, so for the next question by Alistair, he asks, "Does Svelte have a secret internals do not use or you'll be fired?" More similar thing. I'm not sure if you know about that for React, but yeah.
Yeah, I don't think we do. Actually, no, that's not true. So if you create a Svelte component with the new keyword, like widget equals new capital W widget, then that widget object will have a property called $, widget dot $, and inside there we've got all of our secret implementation details. And we could hide it if we really wanted to. There's ways of hiding these things, but we always felt that there was kind of no point, because it's useful for debugging. It's useful for us for debugging, and also like the ways of making them private. You could either use a weak map, or you could use private class fields or other things. These aren't supported in all browsers, so we've always just kind of left it there. This $, object just kind of lying around for people to play with. And occasionally people will play with it. They will look at that and think, oh, I can do some fun hacks with this. And that, if I recall correctly, that is how at least the first versions of our hot module reloading implementation were built. But it very much falls under that category of, like, you use this, you do so at your own risk, because we could change it at a moment's notice. No one's going to get fired over it, but your stuff might break.
Oh, sorry, it was not a meeting.
Oh, oh, did we leave you there?
Yeah, and I do understand with that debugging thing I just said. But yeah, that's a really funny thing that React has too. That is kind of like a meme in the React community. But awesome. So for the next question by Simon, he asks, Svelte being a compiler was an excellent idea. You have experience with compilers or building languages? And I'm assuming in the past.
Yeah, so I mentioned a couple of other projects already today, Rollup and Buble. And Buble is a direct source-to-source compiler, where we would take like your let and your const declarations, and we would turn them into var, and take your arrow functions and turn them into regular functions. And the way that works is we first construct what's called an abstract syntax tree, which is this structured representation of your code. And once you've got that, it's very easy to kind of walk over the abstract syntax tree and find things that are out about your code, find out what your variable names are and all that. And once you've got that information, you can construct some output code. And Svelte is really no different. It's just doing a lot more of that. It's taking the component code that you write, turning it into an abstract syntax tree, manipulating it in various ways, and then outputting JavaScript. And so the reason that I kind of knew that that was a possibility was because I had worked on Buble and before that Rollup. So I was familiar with this idea of abstract syntax trees. And they're really fun to work with. If people haven't dabbled in that world, then I really recommend playing around with some of the AST libraries that are out there. There's also a website called astexplorer.net, which allows you to get familiar with abstract syntax trees without even having to use libraries. And once you've kind of seen what's possible with that, then all of a sudden a whole range of problems become things that you feel like you can solve, as opposed to black magic that is best left to other people. None of it is all that difficult. It's all just kind of new terminology to learn and like a few basic techniques. But once you've got them, then you can do all sorts of stuff in programming.
Yeah, compilers do seem like a very interesting topic to be exploring. Um, yeah, and it seems like something that would take like a bit more knowledge to like not fully understand, but even to make your own. And it seems like yeah, like it's like very interesting. But I'll just leave it at that. And okay, so for the next question, asked by Alistair, he asks, "What are your thoughts on Bun? And do you see it having a future in the JS ecosystem and possibly with Svelte?"
So Bun is amazing. I haven't used it myself, but I've been following Jared Summer, the guy who builds it. He's been tweeting out little previews of what Bun can do on his Twitter feed for the last few months, and it's super impressive. It's written in Zig, which is one of those languages that I mentioned earlier, and because of that, it's incredibly fast. Even faster than things like SWC and Go. SWC and ESBuild, which are written in Rust and Go, respectively. As to whether it has a future in the JavaScript ecosystem, I don't know. One thing that I do worry about a little bit is that so far it seems to be all the work of this one guy, Jared. I don't know that it has much of a contributor base, and I think that's partly it's because it's obviously early days for the project. It's also partly, I think, because it uses this language that not a lot of people know how to use, namely Zig. And so I don't know. I'm not going to start depending on it for anything critical just yet, because we just don't yet know if that project is going to like still be around a year from now. But I kind of hope it is, because it's showing us that a lot of what we do is kind of hopelessly inefficient. And at the very least, I think other ecosystems can steal a lot of those ideas. And hopefully that's a kind of a rising tide lifts all boats situation. Um, yeah, it's a hugely inspirational project. I'm really looking forward to seeing how it turns out over the next few months.
Yeah, I've seen Bun too, like over the past few months again from Jared on Twitter. He's been tweeting a lot about it, and it is something that is very impressive. And it looks amazing, and it's very interesting to see like what it can do. But yeah, and I do agree. I'm not that familiar with Sig. I'm pretty sure that was what it was called, the language. And I'm not sure if a lot of people I haven't heard of it actually before today when you just mentioned it. But yeah, I think I know for a fact that not a lot of people know how to use it. And if it does become open source, that might be another thing to be considering about. Because again, not a lot of people know about it. But I guess we can move on to the next question. From Tejas. Well, it's not a question, but he says your beard is nice.
Very kind, thank you.
All right. So for the next question by Alpha Null, he asks, "What differentiates Svelte from other front-end frameworks like React or Angular?"
Well, back when it started, the differentiation was performance and bundle size. React and Angular both came from an era when more people were browsing the web on desktops than on mobile phones, and that was kind of reflected in the amount of code that is involved when you use those frameworks. Um, I think it was probably around like 2015 that people started to become really conscious of the fact that if you're building the web for a mobile audience, you need to ship as little JavaScript as possible. And so Svelte's differentiating factor when it first came out was that you can build an application using a tiny fraction of the code that you would need if you're building with React or Angular in terms of the amount of JavaScript that the browser has to download. The other big differentiating factor in those early days was that because it's compiling your component code to something resembling what you would write by hand if you were doing vanilla JavaScript, it's very fast. Instead of kind of re-rendering your application and then doing this virtual DOM diffing process where it like crawls through the tree and then sees which bits have updated and which bits have stayed the same, because we're doing a lot of that work ahead of time, we can just skip it. We can keep the static parts the same and just focus on the bits that are likely to have changed. And so because of that, performance-wise, Svelte was leagues better than anything else that came out around the same time. Nowadays, our focus has shifted a little bit because it turns out that you can have the best performance in the world, but people won't care unless your thing is nice to use. And so when we brought Svelte 3 out in 2019, that was the product of us going away and thinking, what should process of building a user interface look like? Like, what is the optimal experience for someone building a user interface? And so we really proceeded from that standpoint instead of focusing on this very high performance implementation and then kind of bolting the API on top of it. And so nowadays, when people ask us what differentiates React from those other frameworks, is that because we're this fully compiled language, we're able to focus on designing the experience of building using Svelte in a way that is much harder with other tools. And so that's it. Our differentiating factor is that we provide what we think is the best possible developer experience without sacrificing on bundle size and the performance that the user experiences when they run your app.
Yeah, I do think that makes sense, and I know that has been a lot of people's questions, just like in general. And it's good to have all of these frameworks. Sorry, I can't speak. It's good to have all of these frameworks like React, Angular, Vue, Svelte, etc. Every other one, and what people need for their own needs. They can pick and choose which one suits them best for whatever they're building. Um, and I guess it just kind of matters on what the person prefers, and if they want to use React for one project, Svelte for another, it's kind of up to them. So I mean, it's really good to have all of these different choices that you can pick from that will suit your needs. So yeah, that's amazing. So for the next question, by Tejas, he asks, any plans to make Svelte native efficient?
So Svelte Native is a project that's been going along for the last few years, and I'm ashamed to say I've never actually used it because I've just never built applications for native applications for mobile. But what it is a wrapper around a thing called native script, which makes it possible for you to build mobile applications not on the web using Svelte components. And we've always talked about wanting to one day kind of bring it into the fold and make that an official project. And perhaps even doing so in a way that that gets rid of the native script middleman. But we've just been so busy with everything else, particularly SvelteKit over the last few months, that we simply haven't had the bandwidth to do so. But it's still something that we would like to do at one point. Yeah, we would.
Yeah, it makes sense. Um, yeah, and it would be. I mean, I haven't actually used Svelte Native before, but I should probably try it out. But I hope that answers Tejas' question. But we're almost done with these Q&A questions. So for the next one by Mateo, he asks, did you have to deal with imposter syndrome while building Svelte, considering your non-CS background?
Yeah, all the time. I still have imposter syndrome now because I work at a company surrounded by some extremely brainy developers, and I work on an open source team with some extremely brainy developers. And I'm often very conscious of the fact that I feel like I just don't know how to do a lot of fairly basic things, particularly around like networking and any kind of DevOpsy stuff. I always flail a little bit, and I'm not sure what I'm supposed to be doing. But I think over time, even though the imposter syndrome itself doesn't go away, you kind of get used to it. And it's like that thing I was talking about earlier with like, everyone else's code base is in a terrible state, just like yours. And you just kind of have to just learn to be okay with that. I think most people feel a degree of imposter syndrome most of the time, just because computer science is this huge topic and no one knows all of it, and you're always going to be surrounded by people who know more about their thing than you do, and they feel the same way about you because you know more about your thing than they do, and so you just kind of learn to be okay with it, I think. But yeah, absolutely, I feel imposter syndrome every day.
Yeah, I think that's something that a lot of people do deal with too. And it's something that will take a while to get over with. And it's similar to what I said earlier about burnouts and what you said too. Yeah, the strategies to overcome it. It's kind of ties in place with this too. But yeah, so moving on to the next question by Lav. He asks, I would love to hear your thoughts on Svelte Native and what you're doing to support its development if you are.
Yeah, so that, I mean, it's basically the same question as before. We're not really doing anything to support it directly at the moment because, as I say, we just don't have the bandwidth. But I remain hopeful that one day, once we have a little bit more breathing room, we'll be able to give that project the love that it deserves and hopefully make it an official extension of the Svelte organization. Um, and yeah, it would be great if we could say that this is the official way that you build native apps with Svelte.
Yeah, it would be cool to see. Just like React Native, it would be cool to see some people building mobile apps with Svelte Native. Since like, well, for those who use on the web, and people that use React Native, I'm sure that some would find Svelte Native useful. Especially those who are currently using it again on the web. But yeah, moving on to the next question. It's kind of if you're on the thread, you could read that one, but it's from Ian at Discord. He asks, how should companies, businesses, and organizations that aren't considered tech or even big tech decide to create new frameworks or systems instead of using existing ones backed by larger enterprises? Or put another way, what went into New York Times' decision to work within Svelte as opposed to going with React?
Ooh, I don't want to give bad advice here because it's very often the case that you are better off using something that has already been built and has documentation and has a community. But if everyone thought that way, then we'd never get anything new. And uh, so the New York Times specifically, they didn't sort of make a decision to go with Svelte at the expense of React. It's more like so mytimes.com is actually built with React. It's a custom React app. But the department that I worked on, the graphics department, was full of people who were free to use whatever technologies they wanted. And so a lot of people, even to this day, will build things with jQuery and underscore and did a lot of D3 and other stuff. Um, and the adoption of Svelte kind of happened organically within that team, largely because I was there and I was able to answer people's questions about it. Um, React always looked a little bit too intimidating for a lot of people on the team, and justifiably so. I think, and so it just never really got a foothold. And so, Svelte grew in this organic fashion and has since been started to be used by other parts of the organization beyond the graphics department. But it was never a top-down decision. It was never the case that someone said, "Oh, we are going to use this instead of that." So it's perhaps not the best example of the thing that we're talking about. I I don't know. I struggle with this because, as I say, if people only ever use what's already out there, then we're not going to get new things. I think that it's really good to have an understanding of the existing tools, and I think it's really good, particularly if you're building something new, to be doing so because you've tried other things and you've found them lacking in some way, or they don't perfectly solve your problem. Um, and very often, when you do build something new, you'll find yourself running into the same problems that were solved by those other tools. And in the process of building it, you will develop an appreciation of why those tools were built the way they were in the first place. And so I would always encourage people to build stuff, to make new stuff, do experiments, try things. That's maybe different from encouraging organizations to adopt those. I think it's good if people are free to build their own solutions to problems, but then not necessarily have those be adopted by an organization until they've developed a little bit of traction organically.
Awesome. Yeah, that's very well put. Um, but yeah, I don't know what to add on to that, but I that was a really good answer. So for the next question here by Balter, he asks, for a beginner, in order to get a job, you probably need React. But what if you really want to work with Svelte? So my question is, for someone at a start of their career, which one is important? What you really like to use, or what the industry uses, and how? Oh, I guess we'll just start off with that. He has other questions, but I guess we'll start off with that one.
Yeah, I would say that it's more important to understand the foundational technologies than it is to understand any particular framework or tool. It's definitely true that you'll have an easier time finding a job as a React developer just because there's so many React shops out there. There are jobs available for more niche things, but I don't think you should only learn the things that are going to land you a job. I think it's good to understand the language itself deeply enough that you can kind of adopt any framework and you can start a job somewhere where they're using something that you haven't used before and you can become productive. As soon as you start thinking of yourself as a React developer or a Svelte developer or a Vue developer, as opposed to a JavaScript developer, then you've kind of pigeonholed yourself in a way that firstly is going to exclude you from some of the jobs that are on the market today. But secondly, and probably more importantly, means that you're already shutting yourself off from the evolution of the community in years to come, because it's pretty hard to imagine that 5 years from now we're all going to be using the same tools. I think there's going to be a huge change in the industry. I'm not making any specific predictions here. I'm just like observing that this is the way that it has always been. There's always new stuff coming out. There's always new techniques and new frameworks and new tools. And if you focus on one of them at the expense of the others, then you're going to make it harder for yourself to adapt in future. So I wouldn't worry too much about it, I guess. Learn the things that make you happy, learn the things that you feel like are going to help you get a job, but don't lose sight of the fact that ultimately it's all just JavaScript.
Awesome. Yeah. Awesome answer. Um, all right. So for the third last question here, Metan asks, is Vercel using or planning to use Svelte in production themselves, or is it purely to support the ecosystem?
I don't think that Vercel is using Svelte for anything at the moment. Um, Maybe it'll happen one day, but I think pretty much all of the developers on the engineering team have, to the extent that they work on front end stuff, have a React background. Um, and so there's definitely like a institutional bias towards React, and I don't see that changing anytime soon.
Awesome, awesome. Yeah. It would be cool to see if they, whatever they plan to do with Svelte, I'm sure they have something in mind. But in the future, it would be very cool to see something that they'd build, maybe as a developer tool even, that people can use with Svelte. But yeah, awesome. So, for the second last question, uh, what the name is in Japanese, so I'll just say the question. So they ask, what do you think of Solid? About before, what AST libraries would you recommend playing with?
Okay, so Solid is very cool. Solid is kind of like React done right in a way. Um, I shouldn't say that because now I'm suggesting that React was done wrong, and that's a terribly impolite thing to say. But Solid is a really well designed library. If So, a lot of this comes down to stylistic preference, right? And I think we're at the point now where if you prefer the JSXy way of doing things, then Solid is a really great option. If you prefer a more templatey approach that combines styles with your markup and your JavaScript, then Svelte is a really good approach. Um, and it's really good to have those choices. And the people who are using Solid at the moment seem to really love it. I'm not using it for anything, but I don't know if people saw the state of JavaScript survey that came out recently. Solid, brand new entrant into the survey, got the top satisfaction of any front end framework. Um, Solid and Svelte both got 90%, and you really can't argue with numbers like those. It has a pretty small user base at the moment. It's like a very early adopterish crew, but those people really love it. So I would definitely encourage people to give it a look. Um, it's it's kind of disproving a lot of the assumptions that we had made about front end framework performance, and it's kind of pushing everyone to do a little bit better. So Solid is great. The second question, what was that? I've completely forgotten.
Uh, oh right, I actually forgot to ask this. Oh, it was about before. What AST libraries would you recommend playing
Ah,
with?
yes. So the one that I'm most familiar with is Acorn. That's the one that is used in Rollup. I think it's possibly still used in Svelte. I believe it is. But there's a few others as well. There's Meriah, Meriyah, which purports to be a smaller, faster Acorn, and one called Cherow, Cherow, which is the same thing, smaller and faster. And they all produce basically the same output because it's kind of semi-standardized. There's a thing called ES which defines what a given input JavaScript is going to get turned into as an abstract syntax tree. And so you can kind of swap out these libraries and see which one has the API that you most like working with, etc. Um, the specifics of the libraries aren't important once you've learned how to manipulate the AST. But those are the three that I would start with. But also just go on AST Explorer and look at the different options on there. You can use Babel's parser, you can use TypeScript's parser. There's a whole bunch, and you should try them all. See what you like.
Very cool. I there was actually a question asked here earlier, but I forgot to ask that, and it was how do you keep motivation when you're doing something that it wasn't your first choice, if that makes sense.
Uh, I don't know. I guess you just have to look for the parts of it that you enjoy. Um, focus on the good bits and treat the rest as a chore that you got to get through.
Yeah, it makes sense. I know a lot of people, they like start a project, and I know this is very common. They start a project, thinking that they're very interested in it, and then later down the line, like maybe like a few weeks later, like a few months, um, they'd realize that they have another idea that they find even more interesting, and they stop having interest in this old idea that they've been building for so long, and then they just drop development on that, and then move to this idea, and then it just constantly happens. And I know that sometimes it may be hard to just stick on one idea, especially when you're building and you get even more better ideas that you want to build. But yeah, I think it's a tough question to answer. And there's no really set thing on what you should do in that scenario. But
There's no shame
Yeah,
in it, you know. We do this
yeah,
because it's fun, and if it stops being fun, then stop doing it, move on to something else.
yeah, yeah. I agree with that. But yeah, I think that pretty much concludes this talk. It's been an hour and 30 minutes now. But that was an amazing talk. I appreciate you taking the time to come here and just telling us all about what you've been up to. And we really do appreciate it. And
Oh,
hopefully we
thank
can
you for
have you
having me,
on.
and thank you for all the questions.
Yeah, no worries, of course. Hopefully we can have you on in the next couple of years and you can tell us what other great things you've been working on. But yeah, I think that pretty much concludes today. The talk will be uploaded to Spotify and YouTube for those who missed it. But yeah, thank you all for coming, and I think that pretty much concludes it.
All right, bye everyone.
All right, bye.